Hi, everyone. As you start to come in, we're going to give it a couple more minutes, let a couple other people join, and then we will get started. Give it a couple more people some more time to come on. Thank you all for joining us right now. We're so happy to have you. All right, I think we're good to get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for our National Jeweler Supplier Spotlight webinar series. Today's webinar is presented by IGI. Before I turn it over to John Pollard at IGI to get the webinar started, I want to let our attendees know that if they have a question, they can type it into the Zoom Q&A box. IGI will answer questions as they see fit throughout the webinar. Also, today's session is being recorded and will be available on the National Jeweler website by Friday. And now I will turn it over to IGI.
Great, thank you very much. And thanks to all participants for being here. We really appreciate you joining us for this particular session and all sessions that we're doing with National Jeweler. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Susan. Susan Bachman is our Chief of Marketing for IGI North America. And she's going to be curating questions. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A tool. Send them in at any time. We're going to go ahead and get started now. This is going to be part one of a two-part series on diamond cut quality, the final frontier. Part two will be delivered next month, also hosted by National Jeweler. Before we start, I did want to provide some background on IGI. IGI is the world's largest gemological organization. We currently operate 29 grading laboratories and 18 schools in 10 countries around the world, employing a workforce of over 1,000 dedicated professionals. Our two domestic locations are in New York and Los Angeles. In the United States, IGI is most recognized as the authority for grading lab-grown diamonds and jewelry, but our institute has been extremely active in all sectors of industry for almost 50 years, grading loose diamonds and gemstones, as well as finished jewelry around the world. IGI partners with almost all of the world's iconic luxury brands, screening millions of carats of their melee to ensure no mixing and providing education for their sales professionals. As it relates to today's presentation, IGI was the first institute to issue cut grading criteria more than 40 years ago, and the first grading lab to issue Hearts and Arrows diamond grading reports worldwide in the 2000s. Last year, we introduced a cut grading system for fancy shapes, incorporating an assessment of light return. I do want to mention that we're going to confine this first session to discussion of performance in round brilliant diamonds. Some of it clearly has overlap, but this is specific to rounds. Today's presentation comes in three parts. Why different terms and systems? What defines diamond beauty? And how can we measure these things? Next month, we'll expand on today's information by debunking some old myths, identifying modern solutions, and taking a look at the future. In any discussion of cut quality assessment, we should begin with a fundamental question. Diamond grading laboratories take the same approach, use the same terms, and apply the same systems for carat weight and color and clarity grading. So why do they use different approaches, terms, and systems for cut grading? Well, universally adopted methods for grading color and clarity were established in the 1950s. At that time, diamonds were traded in person, so buyers could judge for themselves how brilliant one diamond looked compared to the others in the diamond bourse or the jewelry store. This also informs why there is not an eye clean clarity grade. People could see for themselves whether an inclusion was visible. It also explains why color is graded with the diamond upside down, viewed through the side. you can see for yourself in a store how the color compares. And a very well-cut J may face up more favorably compared to other J's because they were graded from the side. So when diamonds were traded in person, there were some judgments that were not made, and cut quality was one of them. So for decades, cut implied shape only, and cut grading was just an evaluation of human craftsmanship details of polish and symmetry, not proportions or performance. Now, we did have a system we knew had identified optimal cut quality in a brown brilliant. These were calculated by a mathematician in 1918, Marcel Tolkowski, and he nailed it. Diamonds near Tolkowski's modern proportions to this day. They have great brilliance, which is overall light return, with equal brightness, white flashes, and fire, colored flashes. Now, for anyone technically minded, modern Tolkowski proportions use a 56% table instead of 53%. That's because Tolkowski was a mathematician, not a diamond cutter, and he postulated a knife edge girdle. So we adjust that 53 to 56 today. I've also added the definitions for the three terms as I described them, since terminology used to describe diamond beauty in different places is not always uniform. We'll come back to that in part 2 of the presentation. As the decades passed, demand for assessment of cut quality increased. In the late 1900s, laboratories, producers, and gem societies began to answer that call. In most or all of these cases, it made sense to start by placing Tolkowski's proportions at the center of the top grade. Now let's take a look at how that logic was applied and went forward. This is an XY grid. It's for diamonds with a 56% table rather. It shows crown angle ascending from left to right on the x-axis and pavilion ascending from top to bottom on the y-axis. Now we can find Mr. Tolkowski's proportions right here at the intersection of a 40.75 degree pavilion angle and a 34.5 degree crown angle. So this is the center of the ideal proportions range as it was defined. These early systems postulated a practical distance from Tolkowski on either side, first for pavilion angle, and likewise a practical distance on either side for crown angle. Apply these ranges across a practical range of table sizes on each side of Tolkowski, in this case, 53 to 59.5. And here you see the fundamental basis for a range of proportions that may be considered ideal. This was developed in the 1980s by IGI. A number of systems developed through the 80s and 90s also used Tolkowski's proportions at their center. However, while the numbers for the top grade are similar, these systems differed from one another. For example, in the IGI system, diamonds with these crown and pavilion combinations qualify for ideal across 7 table percentages. The next system permits somewhat deeper pavilions and shallower crowns and is wider, spanning 9 table percentages. The next, established by one of the world's most well-known luxury brands, spanned 8 table sizes, using a more restrictive range of crown and pavilion angles, which makes sense when producing diamonds that will belong to a single brand. And the last, introduced in 1996, leans towards somewhat higher crown angles, also spanning 7 table sizes. To further appreciate why the systems vary, it's important to remember this only reflects the top grade from each system. Consider these hypothetical examples. All of them use Tolkowski at the center of the system, but some use the term ideal at the top. Others use the term excellent, and the ranges they permit distance away from Tolkowski are not standardized. Logically, this will compound itself when devising ranges for grades below the top grade. So a diamond a certain distance from Tolkowski could wind up earning the top grade in some systems and a second grade in other systems. The top grade could be called X, it might be called ideal, or something else. Now, let's be clear. All of these systems were designed to help consumers, retailers, and the industry by providing differentiation on grading reports, which had not existed before. As we came to the turn of the century, demand for this increased dramatically as diamonds started getting traded on the internet. So the answer to the first question is because there was no standardized approach for assessing light behavior. Polish and symmetry, yes, but not light behavior. Second, even if a standardized approach had existed, no lab could possibly commission over 12,000 master stones to study how all sets of proportions perform. It was just not possible. So the systems were tied to correlations, which were practical at the time. And we should credit the pioneers who made those correlations in the interest of helping differentiate this complex but very important member of the 4 Cs. Now that we understand why different systems were first developed, let's look at what we've learned, particularly since the turn of the century. Simply put, today we have greater visibility and ability to predict diamond performance according to measurements, thanks to structured light environments, our understanding of slope proportions, and computing power. Now let's touch on each of these and what they have shown us. In the 1990s, the first structured light environments, red reflectors, were used to assess light behavior in round brilliant diamonds. Now, red ringed loops had existed since before that, but the first complete environments were like the Firescope, which was developed by 8-star diamonds in Japan in the 1980s, and a more affordable portable red reflector called the Ideal Scope, which was developed in 2001. Now, the American Gem Society's asset, which you may be familiar with, is also a structured light environment using multiple colors. All of these tools, structured light environments, permit us to objectively see a couple of simple fundamentals, whether light entering a diamond will positively return to the viewer's eyes or will negatively window or leak through the pavilion, darkening the diamond. Now, without getting into the weeds too much here, the way that a structured light environment works is that light coming into the diamond is coded a certain color. As you can see from the horizon to approximately 76.5 degrees in the Ideal Scope, it's coded red. And then at the highest angles, it's coded black. And then light beneath the diamond illuminates where light may be leaking or windowing out the bottom. So using the 2 examples on the bottom left and right, a positive specimen is returning essentially all the light that's entering into it. You might see those symmetrical triangular white, those are meet points, facet meet points. They're not supposed to return light or expected to return light, so they're negligible. Meanwhile, on the right, you have this negative specimen. You can see that abundant light that's entering the diamond is actually falling through the center, making that diamond essentially dark in any lighting other than very, very bright spotlights. So those are structured lighting environments. Next, in 2004, slope proportions logic was introduced at the first International Diamond Cut Conference in Moscow, Russia. Now, it showed that a diamond's crown and pavilion angle share an inverse relationship. Simply put, as one gets shallower, the other must get deeper to maintain the same output, the same brightness, the same overall light return. And finally, computing power. The University of Arizona, American Gem Society, University of Moscow, and others have applied computer ray tracing to 3D models of diamonds, permitting us to analyze them in a number of ways, including assessment of their models in structured light environments across a great number of proportion sets. So, what did this show us? This showed us that what we had done in terms of initial proportion systems, essentially taking and moving a distance away from Tolkowski, actually had a slightly different logic. This logic says that as a crown angle gets shallower, the pavilion angle needs to get deeper and vice versa. And we can prove this with structured light environments, both live and also computer modeling. We can see that these proportion sets, some of which were formerly thought perhaps to be too far away from Tolkowski, are actually quite robust. Meanwhile, we can also identify those that are a little bit closer in, which are not necessarily as robust. The other thing we learned here is that the range of crown and pavilion angle combinations that produce great light return, well, that varies according to table size. Especially as you get above 60, the opportunities are less and less and less to have robust light return. This is why the most recent grading systems for round brilliant diamonds, developed or updated after the turn of the century, publish a series of grading charts, one for each table size. So that concludes the first portion, simply understanding where we've been and where we are now. At this point, the initial systems, which were helpful to differentiate, can be improved, and we're improving our understanding all the time with them. Where we're going is also very exciting. So, in order to carry this forward and apply it practically, what defines diamond beauty? You can take a look at all these terms on your screen. Over time, these have been used to describe different components. Well, let's make this very simple. I have a short video for you here.
Let's talk about light behavior and the components of diamond performance. Depending on how it was cut, light entering a diamond will either reflect and return to the viewer's eyes or pass through the bottom of the stone as leakage or windowing. Leakage is generally a negative component, since the facets are acting as windows instead of mirrors, creating undesirable dark or neutral areas. Light returning to a viewer's eye may be perceived as white brightness or as colored flashes known as fire. Dispersion within a diamond separates white light into its component colors so that light entering a diamond exits as dispersed fans of color. If all colors enter the pupil at once, the human brain recombines them and the fan is seen as white brightness. But when a fan is large enough that only a portion of it enters the pupil, the brain sees a flash of that color. So, colored flashes are dispersion seen as fire. Fire is not a constant. It depends on light environment, the constriction or dilation of your pupil, and the diamond itself. Generally speaking, diamond shapes with small tables and high crowns promote fire more than shapes with shallow crowns. That brings us to contrast. Some light from above will always be blocked by the viewer, creating dark patterns. You can see the contrast effect in diamond photos because the camera blocks light the same way a viewer does. A balance of contrast is desirable since the on and off contrast effect when diamonds move is a dramatic component of scintillation. These are the positive beauty components of light behavior. Well-cut diamonds display brightness or reflections of white light, fire or dispersed light seen as flashes of color, contrast, which is the arrangement and dynamics of bright and dark areas, and scintillation, which are all positive components seen when the diamond, viewer, or light source move.
Okay,
Let's talk about light behavior.
Here we go. So for the purpose of continuing discussion, these are the definitions of terms that I would use for various light performance components. Essentially, overall light behavior, you have two fundamental things. Light can either enter the stone and then return properly to the viewer, or it might pass through the bottom of the stone and get lost. Now, by the way, this is not necessarily a bad thing. Diamonds, fancy colored diamonds, are cut on purpose sometimes to have the rays bounce around within the stone more, or even window out the bottom to either entrap the color or to illuminate it from within. So within light return, which is the positive return of light to your eyes, we can define brightness as the visible white light that you see. Fire, and I always say in conducive lighting, fire is dispersed fans of color that your brain will see as colored flashes in conducive lighting. Contrast is the balance, arrangement, and intensity of bright and dark areas. And then scintillation is brightness, fire, and contrast seen when the diamond, the viewer, or the light source are in motion. There are a couple of further clarifications we should make. In terms of fire, all else equal, we do know that higher crowns promote larger dispersive fans. This is because light has an opportunity to travel further through the diamond and disperse more. And when those fans exit the diamond, they're actually larger, so you stand a better chance to see them. We also know larger compound mirrors promote larger dispersive fans. Without getting too technical, essentially optical precision, what you may see as hearts and arrows in hearts and arrows diamonds, which have great crown and pavilion and table combinations. We know that if the compound mirror is larger, then that dispersive fan has a larger head start, and so it can boost visible fire. It's a same thing, by the way, when you think about old cuts, the old European cuts, they used to have massive, wide pavilions, very short lower halves, and those wide pavilions and high crowns promoted big fluid bursts of fire in older cuts. Fun fact, we got the term fire because diamond cutters would cut under gas lamps and really try to maximize the reflections of fire from above. So here, even if the fire factor is strong, the most important thing to remember is that the lighting must be conducive for you to perceive fire. Now, you can use this in your stores. You might have noticed a place at a counter under multiple intense small light sources that drives fire the best. It's the most conducive lighting, by the way, small, intense pinpoint sources. But understand that fire is always going to depend on the illumination environment, as well as the diamond and the pupil of the viewer. Should also mention that scintillation is something that is somewhat personal. It's not simply a function of the lighting environment driving fire, but it's also a function of the individual viewer. Essentially, pupil light reflex, as we mentioned, the constriction or dilation of the human pupil. Someone on cannabis will probably see far less colored flashes than someone completely sober. In terms of stereo vision, we have the human brain, our ability to interpret three-dimensional events in 3 dimensions, depth perception. So a pirate with an eye patch will see scintillation quite differently than the first mate who has depth perception. And then composite cognition, which is really cool. This is the human brain's ability to perceive events which significantly exceed their actual intensity due to the fact that we have 2 eyes. For example, when our eyes detect 2 brightness or fire events in a diamond simultaneously, we combine them into one, compounding their intensity in a uniquely human way. Simply put, while videos are fun and helpful, a camera cannot possibly interpret the complexities of scintillation the same way that a human brain does, and humans can perceive scintillation differently, one person to the next, depending on physiological and environmental factors. Okay, so then how can we measure these things? Well, simply put, scintillation, again, is somewhat personal. It's very environment specific, and it has to do a lot with the way that our brain processes things. So we're going to set scintillation aside. In terms of overall light return, brightness, fire, and contrast, I'm going to talk about structured light environments. There are a number of different approaches. You've got mechanical approaches. You've got human observational approaches. Again, software which can ray trace and come up with its own values. But I like to focus on structured light environments because they're so simple but elegant. We're also going to talk about optical physics because optical physics has something to do with brightness and fire and the balance thereof. In terms of overall light return, it's very easy to use a structured light environment to see how much of the light entering the diamond is coming back. And that's the backbone, isn't it? If we know that a diamond has robust light return, then whether its proportions are shallow or towards the deep side can impact the balance of brightness and fire and contrast. But the bottom line is we're looking for overall light return, whether it's going to be a bright diamond, a fiery diamond, or both. Simply put, you look for negligible light leakage, you can look for some leakage, and then you can look for notable leakage. These are 3 different classifications of diamonds. What about brightness and fire? Well, this is a matter of optical physics. As we mentioned, high crowns tend to produce more fire when lighting conditions are conducive. Low crowns tend to produce more brightness simply because those rays of light have not dispersed as much as they would when there's more diamond material through which for which they pass. The cool thing about brightness and fire is that it's sort of a yin or a yang. Some people used to say brightness is the enemy of fire. I believe they work together. It's just a matter of seeing one versus seeing the other. If you have a diamond that has great overall light return, you're going to get one in huge strength, the other in huge strength, or a balance of both. Optical symmetry bonus, as we mentioned, diamonds would have demonstrably optimum compound mirrors produce more viable fire simply because they have a larger starting place. Contrast. Now, this is cool. And contrast is one that I think is most fascinating, and it's not necessarily talked about a lot. When we grade diamonds, and clarity grading, 10 power, as we know, and color grading, you're looking quite close. And we've tended to use viewing distance of 25 centimeters closer to make judgments. We did some polls of different groups of viewers and found when we said to them, we can just do it right here, actually, for everybody in the group. If I ask you, imagine that you have a diamond ring on your finger, and now you're going to look at it to see how it sparkles. Generally, most people, I believe, in the audience probably put their arm out to just under half arm's length. That's what we've seen. And so we've been using a 40 centimeter distance in addition to research it closer to discuss contrast. And here's why. This is 58% table, and we've modeled in a contrast hemisphere. We've modeled essentially, as you can see, from 30 degrees up to 40 degrees crown angle in increments of half a degree, and then from 40 degrees to 42 on pavilion. Now look what you've got in the middle here. Again, remember slope proportions. This bottom left to top right, that area in the center, which is really light, what we're seeing there is that's essentially an optimum area. Again, this is 80 centimeters away. This is pretty far away. When we bring it to 40 centimeters, which is where a lot of people tend to view their diamonds, now you can see, if you want to correlate the 40.8 with the 30 point, I think I can do this for you. Yeah. So here's 40.8 with Mr. Tolkowski. You can see you have such a nice, pleasant, light tone here, and yet the contrast is still present. So now let's move in a little closer. We move to 25. Look what's happening here. Now we've got a little bit of darkness in the stone. This is how we're used to seeing diamond photos, by the way. But in real life viewing, we don't normally see those pavilion mains turn black. They're usually more silver because we're not necessarily blocking the light as much as the camera would. And start noticing what's happening in the upper left to these shallow pavilion, crown pavilion combinations, especially as we move in now to 20 centimeters. So you could see that the contrast dynamic here, and 20 centimeters is extremely close. If you're looking for an inclusion, you're going to probably get your head down that close. Although if you're my age, it doesn't matter anymore because I can't read the fine print on a dime. So I'll use my loupe, thank you. But we're going to back out again. Here's 25. We use this for part of our research and study. And then 40, we really leaned heavily on 40 because it's really something else, I think, the difference here. And getting in close, you can see how obstruction in the top left there really becomes an issue. So in making our analysis of contrast, we're talking about, first of all, angular draw. The most intense light sources are generally above us. And so diamonds drawing their light from less low, drawing their light from the side, tend to have less contrast in most illumination scenarios. Fun fact, most fancy shapes, by the way, they draw their light from lower angles than round brilliants. Round brilliants, cushions, tend to draw their light from over our shoulders. A lot of fancies draw their light from lower angles, which is why they don't have quite as much contrast, the vivid contrast of a round brilliant. Next thing, our distance balance analysis. We can see on the bottom example here on the right, you can see an obstructed, this is a shallow combination that draws a lot of darkness when a viewer gets close. And then at the same time, at 40 centimeters, if there's no pattern whatsoever, we call that flat. And that's something you don't want to necessarily have either. What's really funny is, it's not funny, it's actually a tribute. What's really a tribute to Marcel Tolkowski is that he generally was spot on. Over 100 years ago, the man was spot on in essentially scouting where the optimum performers are. So that's it. Our overall light return, plus the brightness and the potential, how much fire potential it has in conducive lighting, and adding contrast to that gives us the resultant scintillation, the sparkle, the life, whatever you want to call it, the personality in conducive lighting, and to some degree according to your own cognition. But we can come up with values for overall light return, values for brightness and fire, and values for contrast, and all those things combine to come together in the final assessment, the final sparkle assessment. So that's essentially part one, and love to get some questions from you if you'll submit them. I know we have a couple that I see. In next month's seminar, we're going to use this to take forward. We're going to debunk some old myths. We're going to talk about modern solutions for breaking these components down in individual diamonds. Okay, how do I know if a round has X contrast versus the next one? How do I know if this one has X fire versus the next one, et cetera, et cetera? And then take a look at the future, including fancy shapes, including more computer ray tracing and firepower and things like that, and what may be coming. That's basically it. If we'd like to begin the Q&A, again, your questions are very welcome. Love to have your questions at any time. Hi, Susan.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for the overview of cut quality. Really informative. We have a couple of great questions that came through. The first one is, what does the GemX machine tell us about cut quality?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sorry, what does the GemX machine tell us about cut quality?
Okay, so as I mentioned, there are a number of different approaches that have been taken. And in the 90s, I believe it was, GemX developed the Brilliant Scope. And essentially, it takes a diamond and it will, it puts it through some illumination paces, and then it will count the number of colored and white pixels that it appears. And it will essentially say, this diamond has this many colors compared to this diamond, very user-friendly. One of the reasons that gemological institutes have not adopted mechanical is because there's one issue is relevance to real world lighting. And another one is that diamond cutters could actually cut diamonds which would score perfectly on those mechanical solutions. And so there was sort of a sort of a loaded gun there, in the sense that we don't want just one type of diamond to be cut. But that's what GemX is. And GemX is very user-friendly, was very widely popular for some time in the US, and I think it's popular in China now.
Thanks, John. Next is, do some round diamonds create more fire than others?
As mentioned, we're talking about rounds. I like to go back to the old European cuts. And they were cut literally to maximize the reflections of fire from gas lamps above. Now, lighting at the time was the electrical lighting, which was just starting, is not like the electrical lighting we have now. And so lighting was lower, and those big wide pavilion mains and high crowns meant that you got big flashes of fire, but it also meant that the diamond was not fundamentally as bright. And a lot of times, because you had that very large culet, you would get light leakage and loss through the bottom. But that was the model, really, the old miner and old European cut. And now we have diamonds. There are some cushion cuts, and then there are some modern rounds being produced in a style of old cuts, which have great fire to them. So generally speaking, the width of the pavilion main, the height of the crown, those things drive fire, as does the optical symmetry. If you got top optical symmetry, it gives it a boost. But more than any other thing, remember that it's the illumination scenario that's gonna tell you how fiery that diamond is. I've got you on mute. Okay,
One that just came in on the chat. Are there any physical characteristics in lab-grown diamonds that impact cut grading in a different way than natural?
No, lab-grown diamonds, we've said it quite a bit. They're essentially identical material. In terms of transparency, we have issues in both natural and lab-grown diamonds, but those are things that humans still need to inspect. At this point, transparency is not necessarily something that we can determine from proportions, nor from 3D modeling.
Can you explain the criteria GIA uses for cut grading compared to IGI?
Yeah, GIA it's a human observation. They actually curated, I think, a couple thousand diamonds. I don't want to misspeak, but they curated a lot of diamonds. And then they had human observers basically look at the diamonds through a number of different structured light environments, hemispheres rather, and essentially say, okay, this one is preferable to this one, is preferable to this one. And what's really interesting is that they validated slope proportions. At the same time that we were studying slope proportions using ray tracing and essentially figuring out that, okay, we're probably going to have a different chart for each table size. That's exactly how GIA came to their conclusions, is they publish a chart for each table size, and their results were based on human observational studies.
Okay, and last but not least, unless anything else comes in, describe what Hearts and Arrows does to a diamond performance.
Okay. So Hearts and Arrows is a cute name. I prefer to call it optical symmetry, but Hearts and Arrows were first developed in the late 1900s. Japanese cutters were essentially finding out that if they could get to supersymmetry to the point where if you put a reflective viewer down, you could see patterns in the stone. Now, I need to say, first of all, a Hearts and Arrows pattern is independent of light performance, meaning that you could make a stone perfectly, well, in nature, rather working with rough diamonds, natural or lab grown, it's nearly impossible to make a perfect diamond just because the material is so extremely hard to work with. But let's say that you get very close. You could make Hearts and Arrows or patterns in a stone that did not have great table crown and pavilion numbers. And so the stone could be very dull and lifeless, but in a Hearts and Arrows viewer, it could look perfect. So let's first of all say that light performance, light return is independent of Hearts and Arrows. With that said, to get the patterns to look properly like Hearts and Arrows, you need to be within a certain range, and that range has proven near Tolkowski. And so most Hearts and Arrows makers over history have gotten very close to Tolkowski or right on Tolkowski for their tolerances. As a result, most Hearts and Arrows brands have actually held up quite nicely in terms of comparisons. What supersymmetry can do to a diamond, if you really have that true optical symmetry and you have a nice balance, your lower halves and pavilion mains are nicely balanced, it can boost the amount of visible fire. The other thing it can do is the contrast pattern can become very crisp because those facet reflections overlap even through a range of tilt. And so the description is, if you have one of those top Hearts and Arrows diamonds, we've frequently heard it described as there's a more vivid on and off quality to it. I see so much colored flash. And so that's attributable to again, the compound mirrors overlapping and giving basically dispersion a head start, and then that contrast pattern being nice and crisp.
Thanks. Very informative as always, John.
Thank you. Is that it?
That's everything.
Okay, we'll give it another couple heartbeats while I thank everybody for being here. I really appreciate those of you who attended. If you're interested in learning more, you can always contact us. We're more than happy to help as it relates to anything, any of the 4 C's, or communicating to your clients about natural diamonds and the benefits they bring to so many people upstream. Lab-grown diamonds, kind of the marvel of technology they are. Anything we can do to make sure that that you and your clients are just happy as can be about your offerings and about gemology and diamonds and gemstones in general.
Also, John, if you can just remind everyone about part 2, as there were some people I think that joined a little bit later.
Okay, great. Yeah, we will, National Jeweler will host a webinar next month that will be part 2, so stay tuned. Keep subscribed to National Jeweler. Watch the IGI Gem blog. Here's a shameless plug. Go to the Gem blog at IGI. You'll get 1 email a week if you subscribe, and you'll get our latest content there, and we will promote this there as well.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for being here. We'll see you next time.